Following the devastating final echoes of the Scandinavian campaign in the spring of 1940, the eyes of the world, suspended in a state of tense anticipation, turned with grim certainty to the west. The long, silent, and deeply deceptive period known as the Phoney War was finally reaching its dramatic climax, and the much-anticipated, monumental confrontation between the mobile German Blitzkrieg and the colossal defensive might of the Western Allies was imminent. Yet, the tragedy that unfolded during the French campaign, known to the Germans as Fallgelb Case Yellow, transcended a mere military defeat. It was a profound, systemic failure of imagination, strategic doctrine, and tactical foresight on the part of the entire Allied High Command, the central physical and psychological pillar of the entire Allied defense posture was the monumental system of fortifications known as the Maginot Line. This colossal, fixed barrier, a network of concrete bunkers, integrated heavy artillery batteries, anti-tank obstacles, and subterranean barracks stretched relentlessly along the Franco-German border from the Swiss frontier up to the heavily forested region of the Ardennes. For nearly 2 decades, the French political and military establishment had poured staggering resources, vast amounts of national treasure, and, more critically, an almost religious psychological faith into the line. It was not merely viewed as a physical defense. It was regarded as a geopolitical guarantee that any future war would be slow, attritional, and ultimately fought on terms favorable to France, reflecting the static, exhausting trench warfare paradigm of the First World War. This deep, entrenched reliance on fixed, static defense became the first, most fundamental, and ultimately catastrophic strategic blunder. This defensive mentality rigidly dictated the Allied operational plan, which was codenamed the Dyle Plan or simply Plan D. The entire premise of the Dyle Plan was rooted in a predictable, backward-looking assumption that Germany would inevitably attempt to repeat the strategy that had been employed in 1914, launching its main, overwhelming armored and infantry attack across the open, flat plains of neutral Belgium and the Netherlands, deliberately circumventing the massive obstacles of the Maginot Line from the north. The Dyle Plan stipulated that upon the first confirmed sighting of a German invasion, the very best and most mobile forces of the Allies, including the elite British Expeditionary Force (BEF) and the most powerful mechanized divisions of the French Army, the Groups d'Armies (GA), would surge forward across the Franco-Belgian border into central Belgium. Their mission was to meet the anticipated German main thrust head-on, establishing a pre-selected defensive line along the Dyle River, effectively fighting a forward, preemptive battle in neutral territory. This massive, predetermined commitment of the best Allied reserves into the exposed Belgian plains was a deliberate, catastrophic strategic miscalculation, willingly walking into what would become Hitler's most devastating trap. This deep-seated strategic misjudgment was amplified by a colossal and fatal underestimation of both the German technological advancements in armored warfare and, most disastrously, the strategic potential of the heavily forested Ardennes region. The Ardennes, a rugged, deeply cut, densely forested, and hilly area spanning southern Belgium, Luxembourg, and northern France, was unanimously dismissed by Allied planners as a geographical barrier impenetrable to large, massed armored forces. The Allied command, still dominated by the cautious thinking of individuals like the aging French General Maurice Gamelin, firmly believed that the sheer difficulty of the terrain, combined with the few, narrow, winding roads, would make a rapid, large-scale, coordinated tank breakthrough logistically impossible. Consequently, this entire 80-mile section of the French line, the hinge, connecting the end of the formidable Maginot Line to the exposed Belgian frontier, was deemed a quiet sector and was deliberately entrusted to the weakest, least equipped, and least trained French reserve divisions, who were instructed only to hold a static, limited defense. The underlying Allied mindset was fundamentally passive and reactive, built solely on the premise of meeting a predictable enemy attack with a predictable defense, prioritizing a forward battle in Belgium to save Belgian territory. This catastrophic failure to foresee, or prepare for a truly revolutionary strategic maneuver. A lightning-fast Blitzkrieg breakthrough through the supposedly impenetrable Ardennes created the absolute, fatal vulnerability that the German High Command was seeking. The Allies had built an immense, expensive fortress and then, in their strategic hubris, willingly rushed their strongest forces directly into a strategically exposed northern trap, leaving the critical, vital door to their industrial heartland unguarded and wide open. The stage was tragically, brilliantly set for the most stunning military upset in modern military history. Following the swift, though strategically contained, victories in Poland and Scandinavia, the German High Command Oberkommando des Heers, or OKH, confronted the immediate and pressing necessity of developing a definitive plan for the decisive campaign in the West, recognizing that the war's ultimate fate and the future of the Third Reich would be determined on the fields of France and the Low Countries. German strategists initially defaulted to a conservative, orthodox approach. However, it was precisely the rejection of this traditional military thinking in favor of a daring, revolutionary concept that would ultimately transform the 1940 campaign into a devastating masterpiece of military art. The initial, operative plan for the Western invasion, which carried the code name Auf-Marschplan deployment plan, was essentially a modified, slightly updated version of the infamous Schlieffen Plan employed during the opening phases of World War I in 1914. Developed in late 1939, its central idea was to stage a powerful, overwhelming frontal assault straight through central Belgium and the Netherlands. This initial plan entrusted the main, decisive role to Army Group B Heers Group B under the command of General Fedor von Bock. Von Bock's forces were mandated to commit the bulk of their power against the expected Allied defensive line along the Dyle River, thereby drawing the main concentration of Allied forces, the British Expeditionary Force BEF, and the best French armies, into battle deep within Belgium. The inherent flaw, which many senior generals eventually recognized, was that this predictable approach offered tactical superiority but could not guarantee a strategic knockout blow, risking a costly, drawn-out repetition of the trench warfare stalemate of 1914 to 1918. The architect of the radical, decisive alternative was Lieutenant General Erich von Manstein, who at the time served as the Chief of Staff for Army Group Heeresgruppe, under the overall command of Colonel General Gerd von Rundstedt. Manstein, working closely with the leading exponents of armored warfare, most notably Heinz Guderian, championed an audacious concept that would become immortalized as the Sickle-Cut Plan Sickelschnitt. The core of this plan was as brilliant as it was inherently risky, revolving around a decisive deception. Army Group B Heers Group B would launch a realistic, powerful, yet ultimately secondary offensive through the Netherlands and central Belgium. This action would perfectly mimic the old Schlieffen Plan, forcing the Allies to immediately activate their Dyle Plan and commit their most powerful and mobile forces deep into the Belgian plains, precisely where the Germans wanted them to be isolated as detailed in Part 1. Simultaneously, while the cream of the Allied forces was firmly engaged in the north, Army Group Heeresgruppe, commanded by von Rundstedt and encompassing the bulk of the German panzer divisions, would execute the actual, decisive strike sweeping through the Ardennes forests. This region, which Allied intelligence considered structurally impassable from massive armored forces, was deliberately chosen as the point of least resistance and greatest strategic surprise. Once the breakthrough was achieved, the panzer spearheads, led by aggressive generals like Guderian and Rommel, were given strict orders: do not stop. They were to ignore their flanks, bypass any remaining pockets of resistance, and race with relentless speed westward to the coast of the English Channel. This lightning-fast sickle-cut maneuver was designed to swiftly sever the main body of Allied forces fighting in Belgium from their primary supply lines and the bulk of the French armies in the south, creating a massive, isolated pocket ready for destruction. Manstein was not proposing merely to seize territory. He was proposing to annihilate the enemy's main force in a single, surgical, decisive maneuver, leveraging the very technology, armor, and air support that the Allies had failed to integrate effectively. Initially, Manstein's radical proposal faced intense and determined resistance within the high ranks of the OKH. The old guard of the German General Staff considered the plan reckless, fearing that the long armored thrusts through the Ardennes would leave the panzer forces dangerously overextended and highly vulnerable to powerful French counterattacks on their flanks. Manstein was even strategically transferred to the eastern sector, seemingly to remove him from the Western Front's planning process. But this professional setback did not deter his conviction. The decisive turning point came in January 1940, following an incident known as the Mechelin Incident, where a German aircraft carrying officers possessing copies of the original, orthodox plane crash-landed in Belgium. This security breach forced the German High Command to definitively abandon the old, predictable plan. Hitler, always instinctively drawn to radical, high-stakes solutions, was immensely intrigued by Manstein's audacious idea, which perfectly aligned with his vision of a risky but rapid victory in Scheidungskakt. In February 1940, Manstein personally presented his concept to Hitler. The Führer was reportedly ecstatic, immediately hailing the plan as brilliant, overruling the strong, cautious objections of many of his most senior generals. Hitler formally approved the Sichelschnitt as the foundation of Fallgelb. The commitment was made. Germany would not simply fight to defeat the enemy, but to utterly shock and paralyze them, throwing its most mobile and powerful forces into the most unexpected and seemingly impassable point on the entire map. This audacious decision represented Hitler's greatest military risk, but it was poised to become his most profound and devastating military triumph. The intricate, high-stakes deception conceived by Manstein and approved by Hitler was set into brutal motion on the morning of May 10, 1940. The launch of the German offensive, known simply as Case Yellow, began not with the decisive thrust, but with the massive, anticipated feint designed to lure the Allies into their prepared trap. This initial phase involved the simultaneous invasion of the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, executed primarily by Army Group B, commanded by General Fedor von Bock. This maneuver was deliberately engineered to look exactly like the old Schlieffen plan, confirming every preconception held by the Allied High Command. The sheer scale and savagery of the opening hours were intended to shock and overwhelm. In the Netherlands, German forces quickly faced resistance, but the invasion was marked by unprecedented, novel tactics of the speed war. For the first time on this scale, German paratroopers were utilized en masse to seize crucial airfields, bridges, and command centers deep behind enemy lines. This rapid seizure of key infrastructure, most notably the bridges leading to Rotterdam and The Hague, effectively decapitated the Dutch defense and prevented any meaningful countermobilization. This use of airborne infantry was a revolutionary tactic that demonstrated the fluid, multidimensional nature of the German assault, confounding Allied expectations of a conventional land advance. After just 5 days of valiant, yet hopeless, resistance, and following the devastating, highly controversial bombing of Rotterdam by the German Air Force, the Netherlands capitulated on May 15, 1940. In Belgium, the German forces' primary objective was to ensure the immediate and complete activation of the Allied Dyle Plan. The invasion of Belgium was met instantly by the forward surge of the Allies' best forces, the British Expeditionary Force, the French 1st and 7th Armies, and Belgian divisions rushed across their respective borders to meet the enemy along the anticipated Dyle River line. Just as German planners had hoped, the best and most mobile elements of the Allied coalition had committed themselves into the narrow, exposed Belgian corridor, focusing their entire attention northwards on what they believed was the German main effort. However, the assault on Belgium contained one extraordinary, crucial element that perfectly illustrated the German commitment to strategic surprise: the capture of Fort Ebenemeo. This Belgian fortress, located strategically near Maastricht, was the most modern, technologically advanced, and heavily armed stronghold in Europe, considered virtually impregnable. It guarded the key bridges over the Albert Canal, whose control was essential for the rapid advance of Army Group B. Instead of resorting to a costly, weeks-long siege, the Germans deployed specialized glider troops in a daring, silent, pre-dawn assault. These troops landed directly on the roof of the fortress and neutralized its massive artillery emplacements using revolutionary new hollow charge explosives, effectively silencing the fortress in a matter of hours. The rapid, shock capture of Ardennes, which cost the Germans negligible casualties, secured the necessary bridgeheads, utterly demoralized the Belgian command, and confirmed to the Allies that the northern push was indeed the genuine, overwhelming attack. The deception was now perfectly set, and the Allied forces were rushing headlong into the trap. With the successful, shocking invasion of the Low Countries underway and the vital bridges over the Albert Canal secured by glider troops, the German High Command watched with bated breath as the grand deception began to unfold perfectly. The Allied response to the invasion of Belgium was instantaneous, overwhelming, and tragically predictable. This immediate action was the core objective of the German invasion, to commit the best of the British and French forces to the north, precisely where they could be isolated and destroyed by the main, unexpected thrust. The moment German forces crossed the Belgian and Dutch borders, the Allies activated their long-established defense plan, the Dyle Plan. This plan mandated the immediate forward deployment of the strongest, most modern, and most mobile fighting formations. Leading the charge into the heart of Belgium was the entire British Expeditionary Force BEF, alongside the powerful French 1st and 7th Armies. These forces, equipped with the Allies' best tanks and mechanized units, raced eastward to establish a prearranged defensive line along the Dyle River. The sheer speed of this Allied deployment, executed with confident precision, confirmed to German intelligence that the decoy had worked flawlessly. The cream of the Allied forces, the formations most capable of stopping an armored breakthrough, were now committed to a frontal, conventional battle in Belgium, focused entirely on the northern threat. This mass movement into Belgium exposed the catastrophic failure of Allied strategic thinking. The French, British, and Belgian commanders, having staked their entire strategy on the belief that the Germans would repeat the Schlieffen Plan of World War I, saw the massive northern attack as the only true offensive effort. This misplaced certainty meant they had willingly moved their best counterstrike forces into a geographically exposed salient, putting them well ahead of their primary supply bases and far away from the reserves stationed along the French border. They believed they were saving Belgium. In reality, they were walking into a tactical trap. The Allied forces that drove into the Low Countries represented an immense fighting capability. They possessed more tanks overall than the Germans, and many of their tanks, such as the French heavy B-1 bis, were individually superior in armor and firepower to the early German panzers. However, the Allies committed their armor piecemeal, largely in small, scattered units designed for infantry support, lacking the unified command structure necessary for mass mobile warfare. Their primary mission was to establish a rigid defensive line, not to engage in deep, flexible armored penetration. As the northern armies of the Allies solidified their position along the Dyle Line, engaging in fierce but contained battles with the advancing German Army Group B, they successfully stabilized the initial front in Belgium. However, every mile they advanced eastward served only to widen the strategic gap between themselves and the lightly defended French border further south. Unseen, unchallenged, and unheeded by the Allied High Command, the real hammer blow, comprised of 7 powerful armored divisions, was already rumbling through the supposed impassable terrain of the Ardennes, heading directly for the weakest point on the entire Allied line. The largest body of Allied military strength was now positioned precisely where it would be cut off, isolated, and encircled, as the Allied armies executed their pre-planned maneuver into Belgium, firmly committing their best formations to counter the German feint in the north. The true, devastating strength of the German invasion was unleashed in the south. The moment of strategic truth for the Sichelschnitt Plan arrived on May 10, 1940, as Army Group A, comprising the bulk of the German armored divisions, began its unexpected and rapid thrust through the Ardennes forest. The Allied assumption that the Ardennes was impassable to tanks proved to be a fatal miscalculation rooted in outdated doctrine. While the terrain was indeed difficult, hilly, densely wooded, and crisscrossed by poor roads. The German armored generals, particularly Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel, possessed the confidence and the logistical organization to overcome these natural obstacles. The German advance was not just rapid, it was a sheer flood of mechanized power. Guderian's panzer corps, comprising 3 armored divisions, moved with a relentless, unprecedented speed, utilizing the small roads effectively and driving their infantry support units to the limit. They achieved average advance rates that stunned both the Allied and, at times, even German commanders. The speed of the German advance was not slowed by the terrain. It was amplified by the lack of effective Allied opposition. The German armored column burst out of the Ardennes, having successfully massed their entire advance for 3 days, and arrived at the Meuse River on May 12. The primary breakthrough point was concentrated around Sedan, a location steeped in French military history and psychological significance. The choice of Sedan was deliberate and precise. The defensive line here was held by the French 9th and 2nd Armies, formations primarily composed of poorly equipped, second-rate reserve and depot divisions, the very troops the Allies had deemed sufficient for the quiet sector. They lacked modern anti-tank weapons, air support, and, critically, the mobility and training necessary to withstand the fluid shock of a full armored assault. Guderian knew that time was everything. His tanks could not linger. They had to cross the Meuse immediately before the French could bring up reinforcements. The key to the breakthrough was the use of overwhelming, dedicated air support. The Luftwaffe, specifically its notorious dive bombers, the Junkers Ru 87 Stukas, played a decisive role. On May 13th, the Stukas launched a continuous, coordinated assault on the French defensive positions around Sedan, creating a continuous, terrifying roar of diving sirens and shattering bomb explosions. This concentration of air power, unprecedented in its intensity, was designed not only to destroy fortifications, but also to completely paralyze the will of the defenders. The French troops, many of them older reservists with minimal training, broke under the psychological and physical strain of the sustained aerial bombardment. Under the cover of this terror bombing, German infantry and engineers rapidly established pontoon bridges across the Meuse River. Guderian, ignoring cautious directives from his own superiors to consolidate, personally directed the crossing. The breakthrough was swift and complete. By the evening of May 13th, the first waves of German panzer divisions were across the Meuse, punching a gaping hole in the French defense line. The hole was not just a breach, it was a rupture in the entire Allied strategic fabric, with the river obstacle behind them and the immediate, weak defensive line shattered. The German armored forces did exactly what Manstein and Guderian had planned. They turned west. The vast, open plains of northern France, ideal tank country, lay before them. The road to the English Channel was now open, and the race to isolate the best Allied army still fighting the decoy in Belgium had begun in earnest. The decisive stroke of Case Yellow had been delivered, and the consequences for the entire Western Front would be irreversible. Following the catastrophic breakthrough at Sedan on May 13th, the German offensive entered its most dynamic and decisive phase, the race to the sea. This was the ultimate realization of the sickle-cut plan, a spectacular demonstration of speed warfare where the objective was no longer to fight the enemy, but to bypass and sever them entirely. The success of this move relied entirely on the courage and audacity of the armored commanders, who were instructed to ignore traditional military caution and press the offensive at maximum speed. Regardless of perceived risks to their flanks, the vanguard of this charge was led by the armored groups of generals like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel. Guderian's panzer corps, now operating on open terrain, achieved phenomenal rates of advance, often covering 50 to 60 miles a day, a pace unheard of in conventional military doctrine. The primary axis of advance was westward, aimed not at Paris or any major political center, but directly at the English Channel coast. This aggressive movement exploited the fundamental weakness of the Allied command structure. The French armies were strategically committed to a rigid defensive line, and their communication system had been shattered, preventing any coordinated, centralized reaction to the armored flood pouring out of the Ardennes. The German success stemmed from several key factors. First, they maintained the relentless speed of the offensive, denying the Allies any time to form a new, cohesive defensive line or to organize a proper counterattack. Secondly, the constant threat and presence of the Luftwaffe ensured that any significant Allied troop concentrations or countermovements were immediately spotted and decimated from the air. The German ground forces, enjoying total air superiority, were able to bypass French fortresses and infantry strongholds, leaving them isolated and useless behind the rapidly moving front. The French military doctrine, which required armored units to wait for slow-moving infantry support before advancing, proved utterly incompatible with the new pace of the German attack. The desperation of the situation finally led to the only logical Allied countermeasure: localized armored attacks to try and sever the exposed German spearheads. The most notable attempt was the Battle of Arras on May 21st. British tank forces, along with French mechanized units, launched a spirited, albeit small-scale, counterattack against the flank of Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. Initially, this attack caused significant panic and confusion within the German ranks, as the thick armor of the British Matilda tanks proved almost immune to standard German anti-tank guns. However, the counterattack was localized, lacked adequate strategic support, and failed to achieve its ultimate goal. The Germans quickly recovered, calling in the feared 88mm flak guns, anti-aircraft artillery used in an anti-tank role to destroy the British tanks, and Rommel continued his relentless push by failing to consolidate their counterattack. The Allies lost their last major opportunity to halt the encirclement. Guderian's corps pressed on, and on May 20, 1940, the armored spearheads reached the coast near Abbeville. This single, decisive act completed the sickle cut maneuver. The German forces had successfully driven a 20-mile wedge between the Allied armies in the north and the main French forces in the south. The strategic consequences were devastating. A vast, formidable army comprising the bulk of the British Expeditionary Force, the strongest French armies in the north, and the entire Belgian army was now completely isolated and trapped in a shrinking pocket stretching from the Belgian coast down to the Channel ports. Their primary supply lines were severed, their lines of retreat were cut, and their fate now depended entirely on holding a small coastal strip around the port of Dunkirk. The swiftness of the operation was staggering. In just 10 days, the Wehrmacht had decisively won the Battle of France, with the German armored spearheads reaching the Channel coast at Abbeville on May 20, 1940. The sickle cut was complete. The consequence was a military disaster of the first order for the Allied coalition. The entire, powerful northern force comprising the vast majority of the British Expeditionary Force (BEF), the best French armies, and the entire Belgian army was cut off and isolated in a rapidly shrinking, vulnerable pocket in northeastern France and western Belgium. Their lines of supply and communication were entirely severed, and the immense German machine was now poised to deliver the final, crushing blow. The immediate objective for the trapped Allied forces shifted from fighting to survive a campaign to fighting to survive long enough to escape. The only viable exit point was the small, shallow water port of Dunkirk and the surrounding beaches. The situation was desperate. The German panzer divisions, having executed their audacious dash to the sea, were now turning north and east, aiming to compress the trapped armies against the Channel. The fate of the entire BEF, and with it, the only coherent fighting force Britain possessed, hung by the thinnest of threads. The loss of the BEF would have inevitably led to Britain's almost immediate surrender. The situation was irrevocably changed by one of the most debated and critical decisions of the entire war. The German halt order issued on May 24, 1940, just as the German tanks were within a terrifyingly short distance of Dunkirk, poised to overrun the port and capture hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers. The order came from the highest command levels to stop the tanks. The precise reasons for this halt have been debated by historians for decades. Theories range from Hitler's personal, decisive intervention, possibly swayed by Hermann Göring's boast that the Luftwaffe alone could destroy the trapped forces from the air to the practical concerns of generals like Gerd von Rundstedt, who feared exposing the tanks to potential counterattacks on the marshy, difficult terrain around the canal network and wanted to save them for the upcoming final push into France. Whatever the specific reason, the effect was monumental. The pause lasted for 3 crucial days, providing the Allies with an invaluable, completely unexpected window of time. During this brief, miraculous reprieve, the British government initiated Operation Dynamo, the vast, improvised, and heroic naval evacuation effort. Commencing on May 26, the operation mobilized every resource available. Initially planned to save a mere 45,000 men, the operation grew into one of the greatest maritime endeavors in history. The Royal Navy dispatched all available destroyers and personnel ships, but the true symbol of the operation became the little ships of Dunkirk. Hundreds of small civilian vessels, fishing boats, yachts, lifeboats, tugs, and pleasure craft, often manned by their civilian owners, sailed across the channel. They navigated the shallow waters near the beaches, where the larger naval destroyers could not venture due to the risk of grounding. Ferrying soldiers from the shore to the waiting ships offshore, the evacuation proceeded under continuous, merciless attack from the German Luftwaffe, the Royal Air Force RAF, fighting furiously and often unseen by the men on the beaches, engaged in intense aerial combat with the German fighters and bombers, providing crucial air cover and preventing the aerial destruction of the entire fleet. The fighting was desperate, and thousands of men faced harrowing decisions under fire, having to wade through the cold water for hours, leaving behind their equipment, hopes, and many of their comrades. When the operation concluded on June 4, 1940, the number of rescued personnel was staggering: 338,226 Allied soldiers, 2/3 of whom were British and 1/3 French, were successfully evacuated. This was, militarily, a colossal defeat, as all heavy equipment, transport, and supplies were left behind. However, politically and morally, it was a miracle of deliverance. The survival of the BEF meant that Britain retained the trained military corps necessary to continue the fight. The miracle galvanized the British public and gave Prime Minister Churchill the essential breathing room and the political capital to continue his defiant stand against Hitler. The German halt order at Dunkirk became, arguably, the single most costly error of the entire Western campaign. The miracle of Dunkirk, the successful evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force, marked the end of the first, catastrophic phase of the German offensive, but it did not end the Battle of France. While the survival of the BEF was a moral and political triumph for Britain, it left the remaining French armies alone to defend a vast, fractured, and demoralized front. The German High Command, confident in the success of the sickle cut, quickly prepared for the second, decisive phase of the campaign, Case Red, or the offensive south of the Somme River. The objective of Case Red was simple: to annihilate the remaining French armies, capture Paris, and force the total surrender of France. The Germans utilized their newly rested and resupplied panzer divisions, turning them south. The offensive began on June 5, 1940, striking across the Somme and Aisne rivers. Unlike the initial, audacious thrust through the Ardennes, this phase was a massive, conventional frontal assault, but it was executed with the same devastating speed and coordination that characterized the Blitzkrieg. The French attempted to mount a desperate defense, deploying their remaining forces along the Maginot Line, named after the new French commander-in-chief, General Maxime Weygand. This defense was doomed for several critical reasons. First, the French had lost the majority of their best, most modern, and mechanized units in the Belgian trap and at Dunkirk. Second, the constant movement, lack of air cover, and continuous strategic retreats had utterly exhausted the morale and physical capabilities of the remaining French soldiers. The German forces, by contrast, were fresh, confident, and possessed overwhelming air superiority provided by the Luftwaffe. The German armored forces, still commanded by the aggressive leaders like Guderian, quickly found new weak points and exploited them. The French defensive line, stretched thin and lacking mobile reserves, was breached almost immediately. The German advance was relentless. Tanks poured through the breaches, repeating the strategy of deep penetration, bypassing major cities and striking at the nerve centers of communication and transport. The swift movement rendered French resistance ineffective. As French units were isolated and quickly encircled, the psychological impact of the continuous German advance was profound, leading to a massive social disruption known as the Exodus. Millions of French civilians, terrified by the rapid movement of the German armies and the stories of atrocities from previous campaigns, fled their homes and choked the southern roads. This mass movement of refugees, estimated at up to 8 million people, crippled the remaining French military logistics, making troop movement, communication, and resupply virtually impossible. The entire country seemed to be in a state of chaotic, desperate motion, a civilian stampede that accelerated the military collapse. By June 14, 1940, the ultimate psychological symbol of the campaign fell. Paris, the French government, having already fled the city to the south, declared Paris an open city to spare it the destruction suffered by Rotterdam and Warsaw. German troops entered the capital unopposed, marking a profound moment of national humiliation for the French people. The fall of the capital signaled the final, complete collapse of French political and military will, paving the way for the inevitable surrender. The stage was set for a political decision that would end the fighting, but bitterly divide the nation for decades to come. The unopposed entry of German troops into Paris on June 14, 1940, stripped the final layers of morale and political will from the already fractured French government. With the military situation beyond repair, the armies fragmented, the civilian population in flight, and the political capital abandoned, the inevitable question became not if to surrender, but when and how. The French government, having retreated first to Tours and then to Bordeaux, descended into political chaos, marked by a bitter and profound internal schism. On one side stood those who advocated continuing the fight, led primarily by a few resolute figures like the future General Charles de Gaulle, who was briefly Under-Secretary of State for War. This faction urged the government to evacuate to the French colonies in North Africa. They argued that France still commanded a vast global empire, a powerful navy, and immense resources, and that the war must continue from the colonial base alongside Britain. They believed that by maintaining the struggle, France could preserve its dignity and claim a place among the eventual victors. Opposite them stood the powerful defeatist faction, led by the 84-year-old World War I hero, Marshal Philippe Pétain. This faction argued that further resistance was a pointless act of bloodshed, demanding an immediate armistice. Pétain and his supporters feared that continuing the fight would lead to the total occupation of France and the complete destruction of its social order. Pétain's influence, rooted in his immense prestige from the Battle of Verdun, was overwhelming. His faction prevailed, and the government decisively chose the path of surrender. On June 16, Prime Minister Paul Reynaud resigned, and Marshal Pétain was installed as the new head of state. With a clear mandate to seek an immediate armistice, Pétain's first act was to announce to the demoralized nation his intention to stop fighting and to seek an honorable peace. He immediately issued a formal request to the Third Reich, via the Spanish government, for the terms of an armistice. The response from Hitler was swift and triumphal. The Führer was determined to make the surrender of France not just a military victory, but a moment of profound, symbolic revenge for Germany's own humiliation at the end of the First World War. Hitler personally selected the location for the signing, the Rethons clearing in the Compiègne forest. This was the very site where, on November 11, 1918, the armistice that ended World War I had been signed, sealing Germany's defeat. Hitler ensured that the original railway carriage, once used for the 1918 signing, was pulled from a museum and placed precisely on the same spot. The symbolic reversal was complete and utterly deliberate. On June 21, 1940, the French delegation arrived to receive the German terms. Hitler was present only briefly, reviewing the scene with immense, quiet satisfaction before departing, leaving the terms to be dictated by his generals. The French delegates were given no opportunity to negotiate. They could only receive and accept the terms of the treaty. The second armistice at Compiègne was signed on June 22, 1940. The terms were devastating, but they deliberately allowed for the continued, albeit limited, existence of a French state. The core term of the armistice was the partition of France. The northern two-thirds of the country, including the entire Atlantic coastline and Paris, was placed under direct German military occupation. The southern third was left as an unoccupied zone, governed by the new French regime under Marshal Pétain, known as the Vichy regime, named after the resort town where the new government established its capital. This agreement served Hitler's strategic goals perfectly. It neutralized the powerful French navy, secured the valuable Atlantic coast for U-boat operations against Britain, and freed up the bulk of the Wehrmacht for future, greater operations in the east, all without the administrative burden of occupying the entire country. The Third Republic was dead, replaced by a collaborationist regime that would rule over a defeated, divided nation. The signing of the Second Armistice at Compiègne on June 22, 1940, instantly ceased the fighting but inaugurated a period of profound national humiliation and division for France. The armistice terms, dictated entirely by Hitler's desire for strategic advantage and historical revenge, formally partitioned the nation into two distinct zones, fundamentally altering the political map of Western Europe and creating complex challenges for the remaining belligerents, the northern two-thirds of the country, stretching from the Belgian border down through Paris and crucially encompassing the entirety of the French Atlantic and Channel coastlines, was placed under direct German military occupation. This area contained France's industrial heartland, its major cities, and its most vital ports. German control of this coastline was essential for the looming Battle of Britain and the future of the U-boat campaign in the Atlantic. The occupation was harsh, administered by the military, and strictly focused on resource extraction and security. Against the nascent resistance movement, the remaining southern third of France was designated as the unoccupied zone. This territory was governed from the resort town of Vichy by the new authoritarian regime led by Marshal Philippe Pétain. This Vichy regime was officially sovereign and technically neutral, but in reality, it was a collaborationist puppet state entirely subservient to the dictates and strategic needs of Berlin. This unique arrangement served Hitler perfectly. It relieved the German army of the massive logistical burden of garrisoning the entire country, while ensuring that the French bureaucracy and police forces would manage internal stability, suppress any resistance, and actively assist in the persecution of Jews and political enemies. The most urgent and potentially destabilizing issue arising from the armistice was the fate of the formidable French Navy Marine Nationale. At the time of the surrender, the French fleet was the fourth largest in the world, with numerous modern battleships, carriers, and heavy cruisers. Hitler's armistice terms stipulated that the French fleet was to be disarmed and demobilized under German and Italian supervision, with the promise that it would not be used by the Axis powers. For Britain, this promise was worthless. Winston Churchill and the Admiralty recognized that if the French fleet were to fall into German hands, the naval balance of power in the Atlantic would shift catastrophically, potentially making the planned invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, a far more feasible proposition. Churchill demanded immediate action to neutralize this threat. The subsequent British operation, tragically codenamed Operation Catapult, was swift and brutal. On July 3, 1940, the British Navy launched simultaneous attacks on French naval assets worldwide. The most devastating strike occurred at Mers el-Kabir in French Algeria, when the French admiral there refused the British ultimatum to either join the Allied cause, sail to a neutral port, or scuttle their ships. The Royal Navy opened fire. The result was a catastrophic, deliberate tragedy. Nearly 1,300 French sailors were killed, and several major warships were destroyed or crippled. Operation Catapult was a political disaster that created intense bitterness and hostility between the two former allies, momentarily validating Pétain's anti-British stance. However, it was a strategic necessity. Churchill demonstrated to both the world and, crucially, to Hitler, that Britain would stop at nothing to prevent the French fleet from falling into Axis hands. By confirming that the French naval assets were unusable by Germany, Churchill effectively secured the immediate naval defense of the British Isles, mitigating one of the most critical threats facing Britain in the summer of 1940. The full consequences of the partition and the fate of the fleet would define the strategic geography of the war for years to come. The signing of the Armistice by Marshal Philippe Pétain on June 22, 1940, and the subsequent establishment of the collaborationist Vichy regime profoundly wounded the French national psyche, plunging the nation into a bitter, devastating debate over collaboration versus continued struggle. The official military defeat was complete, but the moral and political battle for the soul of France had only just begun. While the majority of the military command and the Parliament accepted the inevitability of the armistice, a small, defiant minority refused to accept the finality of the defeat. The central figure in this nascent movement of defiance was General Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle, a relatively junior officer at the time, had been a vocal proponent of mechanized warfare and had served briefly as the Under-Secretary of State for War in the final, chaotic days of the French government. Crucially, de Gaulle was in London on a mission when Pétain announced his intention to seek an armistice. Recognizing the catastrophic political and moral implications of surrender, de Gaulle, with the vital support of Winston Churchill and the British government, made a historic decision. On June 18, 1940, a date now immortalized in French history, de Gaulle delivered his famous appeal of the 18th of June over BBC radio in London. This broadcast was revolutionary and utterly defiant. De Gaulle proclaimed that the battle for France was lost, but the war was not over. He argued passionately that the conflict was not merely a Franco-German affair, but a world war, and that France possessed immense resources, a massive colonial empire, and, critically, a large fleet that allowed the struggle to be continued from outside the metropole. He rejected the authority of the Vichy regime, calling upon all French soldiers, officers, engineers, and workers who were on British soil, or who could escape, to join him and continue the fight. This single, seminal act established the foundation of Free France, La France Libre. The immediate challenges faced by Free France were immense. Initially, de Gaulle commanded only a handful of officers and soldiers, and he lacked official international recognition and domestic support. The Vichy regime branded him a traitor and sentenced him to death in absentia. However, the appeal provided a vital rallying point for the growing number of French pilots, sailors, and colonial administrators who chose exile over collaboration. The key strategic objective of the Free French forces was to win control of the French colonial empire, securing vital territories in Africa and the Pacific that could serve as operational bases for the Allies. Concurrently, within occupied France itself, the seeds of an underground resistance were being sown. These first acts of defiance were disorganized and often localized, emerging spontaneously among veterans, students, and patriotic citizens horrified by the sight of German military rule in Paris. These isolated cells began with simple acts, distributing anti-German leaflets, gathering intelligence on German troop movements, and assisting stranded British soldiers. This nascent resistance was initially entirely separate from de Gaulle's London-based Free France movement. The French campaign therefore birthed two distinct, yet ultimately intertwined, movements. On the one hand, Free France, operating externally with Allied support, served as the political and military voice of a France still at war. On the other, the French resistance, La Resistance, operating internally under extreme duress, maintained the continuity of the national spirit. The persistence of both movements guaranteed that, when the time came for the eventual liberation of Europe, France would be present, not merely as a freed territory, but as an active, defiant participant in its own deliverance. The defeat was complete, but the struggle was far from over. The swift, decisive conclusion of the French campaign in June 1940, culminating in the armistice at Compiègne, was far more than a conventional military victory for Nazi Germany. It was a profound historical event that violently reshaped the global strategic landscape of the war. The defeat, achieved in just 6 weeks, was a stunning testament to the efficacy of the Blitzkrieg doctrine and exposed fatal flaws not only in French military doctrine, but in the entire mindset of the interwar democracies. The immediate strategic consequence was the total exposure of Great Britain. With the French Atlantic coast secured by German forces, Britain lost its primary continental ally and was left militarily isolated. The subsequent Battle of Britain became an inevitable consequence of the fall of France, as Hitler sought to clear the final obstacle for his planned invasion. Furthermore, the German control of the entire Western European coastline provided the Kriegsmarine with invaluable submarine bases from which to launch U-boat operations, dramatically intensifying the Battle of the Atlantic and plunging Britain into a near-existential struggle for its maritime supply lines. However, the fall of France also had profound global repercussions that extended far beyond the European continent. The collapse immediately brought into question the loyalty and control of the vast French colonial empire. The establishment of the collaborationist Vichy regime complicated Allied efforts in North Africa, the Middle East, and Indochina, forcing the British to make difficult and sometimes bloody decisions, such as the tragic attack on the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir to secure their own strategic interests and prevent French assets from falling into German hands. Conversely, the defection of key colonies to Free France, galvanized by Charles de Gaulle, provided the Allies with crucial staging grounds for later campaigns, particularly in Africa. Militarily, the campaign served as a brutal, final lesson in modern warfare. The devastating effectiveness of the sickle-cut maneuver, the deep, uninterrupted penetration by massed armored divisions, demonstrated conclusively that the era of static trench warfare was over. The French reliance on linear defense and the piecemeal distribution of their powerful tank assets proved fatal. The speed of the German victory was a strategic masterclass that would be studied and adapted by all sides throughout the rest of the war. The profound political schism left by the defeat, the agonizing choice between the submission of the Vichy regime and the defiant resistance of Free France would plague the French nation for decades, generating deep internal divisions that lasted long after liberation. The German occupation, though initially less brutal than the campaign in Poland, rapidly transformed into a complex apparatus of control, exploitation, and terror, fueled by the cooperation of the collaborationist authorities. Ultimately, the French campaign achieved what the German High Command had sought since 1914, the swift, decisive defeat of their primary enemy in the West. It provided Hitler with the prestige, resources, and strategic confidence to turn toward his ultimate, long-planned target in the East. By defeating the Western Allies so quickly and completely, the stage was definitively set for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, which would open the war's largest and most brutal theater. The 6 weeks in May and June 1940 decided the fate of France, but they accelerated the world toward the inevitable global catastrophe that was to follow.